Namaskar, this is Firstpost and you're watching Vantage with me, Palki Sharma. Israel has intensified its attack on Gaza. Their forces have surrounded the city of Khan Yunis. More than 16,200 people have died. 80% of Gazans are said to have been displaced. Arab nations are finalizing a draft resolution for the United Nations Security Council calling for another ceasefire. But guess who Hamas has turned to for help? Pakistan. The Hamas chief says brave Pakistan can make Israel back off. It's not a joke. We'll tell you all about the Hamas-Pakistan nexus and why Islamabad's support has been lukewarm this time. Meanwhile, American support to Israel may be dwindling, all thanks to the presidential election that Joe Biden has to fight next year. We'll explain. In China, the economy is in very bad shape. The yuan is struggling and the IMF says their local government debt could be as high as $11 trillion. Also, how coffee giant Starbucks has lost $11 billion due to politics. What message India has sent to the generals of Myanmar. How the Republican presidential debate in America has turned into a shouting match. Why Barbados wants the UK to pay them $4.9 trillion. How a new oil war is brewing in South America and a French law that says roosters have the right to crow. All this and more coming up. The headlines first. Days after the US claimed an Indian link to a foiled plot to kill a Khalistani terrorist, New Delhi forms an inquiry committee. Canada has made similar allegations, but External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar says no evidence has been provided by Ottawa. A huge blast at an explosives depot in Seychelles has left more than 60 people injured. The president declares a state of emergency. The blast in Mahe, the largest island in the Indian Ocean nation, also brought down buildings. Russia to hold its presidential election on the 17th of March next year. President Vladimir Putin is expected to win a fifth term in office. Since 1999, Putin has been in power, either as president or prime minister. Voting is also planned in Ukraine's Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson and Zaporizhia, which Russia annexed. Azerbaijan's leader Ilham Aliyev calls for a snap presidential vote on the 7th of February. In September, Azerbaijan recaptured Nagorno-Karabakh from Armenian separatists. Since then, the president's popularity has been soaring. Elections were previously scheduled for 2025. Turkish President Erdogan promises a new era in relations with historic rival Greece. Erdogan is on his first official visit to Athens since 2017. Both countries have long-standing territorial disputes in the Aegean Sea. But since February, ties have improved. And Luis Rubiales is back in the news for kissing again. He has now been accused of forcefully kissing an English football player. This was at the same ceremony where he kissed Spain's Jenny Hermoso without her consent. After this, Rubiales was forced to resign as the president of the Spanish Football Association. Hamas is getting desperate. How do we know? Because they're asking Pakistan for help. Pakistan of all countries, that's right. A senior Hamas leader addressed an online event in Pakistan. His name is Ismail Haniyeh. You may have seen his pictures. Haniyeh has been the face of Hamas since the October 7th attacks. Threats, warnings, appeals, all of it has come from this man. So what did he tell Pakistan? Let me quote. If Israel faced resistance from Pakistan, the perpetration of cruelty could cease. And he did not stop there. Haniyeh said Pakistan is a brave country, the land of mujahideen. I guess the question is why? Why does Hamas think Pakistan can bring a ceasefire? First, some basic facts. Islamabad does not recognize Israel. They have no diplomatic relations with Israel. In the past, Pakistan has been a staunch critic of Israel. They've sent aid to Palestine, maybe even trained Hamas fighters. Of course, neither side has confirmed this. But in 2021, a Pakistani senator blew the whistle. He said Islamabad used to train the Hamas. Plus, the Pakistani people are in full support of them. Look at a poll conducted after the October 7th attack. 91% Pakistanis supported Hamas, only 2% had sympathy for Israel. We've also seen massive rallies in Pakistani cities. In Karachi, Islamabad, Lahore and Rawalpindi, thousands of people attended these rallies. They shouted anti-Israel slogans. There is also a boycott campaign. McDonald's was under fire for giving free meals to Israeli soldiers. So was Coca-Cola and Pepsi. Some Pakistanis were seen emptying soda bottles on the streets. Take a look at this. On paper, Pakistan's support counts. It is home to 240 million Muslims. It's the only Islamic nuclear power. It also has a history of backing Hamas. So you would think Pakistan is already on board. Then why the appeal for help? Because Islamabad's position is changing. Let me take you back to October 7th, just hours after the Hamas attack. Look at this statement from Pakistan's caretaker Prime Minister. He says he's heartbroken by the violence. And remember, this is before Israel hit back. Now compare this to other Asian Muslim nations. Malaysia defended Hamas. Iran congratulated Hamas. But Pakistan was wary. They said civilians must be protected. Why do you think that is? Political convenience. Pakistan is going through a major economic crisis. They need bailouts from the International Monetary Fund. And who can help them with that? The US and the West. So Pakistan forgets its Palestinian activism. And this has happened before. In 1970, Jordan fought a war with Palestinian armed groups. They were hijacking planes, even plotting to oust the ruling dynasty. So the Jordanian king put his foot down, and advising him was a Pakistani military officer, Zia-ul Haq, the man who later became dictator. Many Palestinians remember his role vividly. They call him the butcher. So my point is, Pakistan's support for Palestine is not based on ideology or even religious brotherhood. It is based on convenience. And right now, it is convenient for Pakistan to be silent, to not criticize Israel too much. Having said that, not everyone in Pakistan feels that way. Like I said, the public is pro-Palestine, and Islamist parties are capitalizing on that. Like the JUIF, the Jamaat-e-Ulema-e-Islam Fazl. Its leader traveled to Doha last month. He met Hamas leaders and expressed solidarity with them. Another example is the Jamaat-e-Islami. Their chief also visited Doha last month. He met the top Hamas leadership. So there are two forces in Pakistan, both moving in the opposite directions. One is the Islamist parties cozying up to Hamas. The second is the establishment, which can swing either way, which is why Hamas is appealing to Pakistan. They need all the help they can get. But frankly, don't expect much. In October, Pakistan's army chief spoke about the crisis in West Asia, and guess what he said? He promised his full moral support for Palestine. But against Israeli rockets, moral support is as good as nothing. And speaking of support, America's support to Israel could be wavering. It's taken 62 days and 16,000 deaths. It looks like Joe Biden is softening his stand. Again, how do we know? Because of some new policies. The White House has announced a new travel ban on Israeli settlers. These are people living in the West Bank. If they engage in violence, the US will not give them visas. That's the new policy. And to be fair, it was coming. Settler violence has been on the rise since the Hamas attack. Daily attacks have doubled since October. So now the US is cracking down.
Levels not seen since the Second Intifada. And in recent weeks, an alarming surge in violent acts has driven this unwelcome record even higher. Under this policy, the United States will pursue visa restrictions against individuals involved in or meaningfully contributing to the undermining of peace, security, or stability in the West Bank.
It may not seem like very much, but this travel ban is a big political statement. It is the first red line drawn by the US. Until now, that was not the case. Biden had given Prime Minister Netanyahu a free hand. Airstrikes, ground offensive, hostage release, everything was done based on Netanyahu's wishes. Maybe not anymore. Biden's top officials have changed their tone. Like Pentagon Chief Lloyd Austin, he spoke at a military conference this week. Listen to his message for Israel.
You see, in this kind of a fight, the center of gravity is the civilian population. And if you drive them into the arms of the enemy, you replace a tactical victory with a strategic defeat. So I have repeatedly made clear to Israel's leaders that protecting Palestinian civilians in Gaza is both a moral responsibility and a strategic imperative.
Vice President Kamala Harris went one step ahead. She was at the COP28 summit this week. Like Austin, Harris also drew a red line for Israel. Listen in.
International humanitarian law must be respected. Too many innocent Palestinians have been killed. Frankly, the scale of civilian suffering and the images and videos coming from Gaza are devastating. 5 principles guide our approach for post-conflict Gaza. No forcible displacement, no reoccupation, no siege or blockade, no reduction in territory, and no use of Gaza as a platform for terrorism.
So to recap, don't target civilians, don't push Palestinians out of Gaza, don't occupy the Strip, and don't promote violence in the West Bank. Those are America's red lines. Will Israel agree to them? Netanyahu keeps saying that he will protect civilians, that he will only target Hamas. Yet, more than 16,000 civilians are dead, out of which more than 6,000 are children, and Israel is not done yet. They're now targeting southern Gaza. Tanks and soldiers have reached the city of Khan Yunis. Reports say there is house-to-house fighting. So chances are more civilians will die. Critics say America's policy change has taken too much time. Nonetheless, let's look at why it's happening now. One reason is obviously the scale of destruction. Gaza is almost unrecognizable. Around 1.8 million people have been forced to flee, which is 80% of their total population. You can't just keep ignoring that. So concern is one reason, but a bigger factor is politics. Biden is heading into an election next year, and his support for Israel seems to be backfiring. Let me show you what a poll found this week. 63% Democrats oppose Israel's campaign in Gaza. 63% oppose. Among younger adults, it's 67%. And among voters of color, it's 64%, which is a big headache for President Joe Biden. His voting base is mainly young and minority voters, but most of them do not like what Israel is doing. And it could cost him the White House. There are more than 3.5 million Muslims in the US. Around 2 million are Arab Americans. If they abandon Biden, he could lose next year. Some Muslim groups have already declared their position: no votes for Joe Biden.
We are announcing that President Biden has lost the 2024 election. We are not powerless as American Muslims, we are powerful. We don't only have the money, but we have the actual votes. And we will use that vote to save this nation from itself.
Tells you why Biden is worried. He won a lot of states by a very small margin the last time. Like Michigan, for example. Biden won Michigan by 150,000 votes in 2020. 150,000 votes. And how many Arab Americans does the state have? Around 280,000. It's the same in Arizona and Georgia. So Biden's changing tone is political. The question is, how does it affect Israel and Netanyahu? They don't need US military or their help to win this war. But beyond that, they do need Washington to replenish their arsenal, to repair ties with Arab states, and to shield them at the United Nations Security Council. So it's a tough one for Netanyahu. Only a complete destruction of Hamas can salvage his political career. But if Joe Biden puts his foot down, he may have to cease fire. And now let's talk about China. A tsunami has hit the Chinese economy. It came in the form of a report, an assessment from ratings agency Moodys. They've downgraded China, and now Beijing is trying to downplay it.
The fundamentals of China's long-term economic growth have not and will not change. We are confident and capable of achieving long-term stable development.
The verbal attacks did not help. The report proved to be devastating. Investors are making a beeline to exit China. Today, Hong Kong witnessed a mass sell-off. Companies in the Hang Seng Index are taking a beating. They're approaching a 13-month low.
I think sentiment has been extremely fragile over the past 3 years. And we see investors reacting quite strongly to any negative headline. So you saw equity markets in particular correcting very strongly.
The yuan too is having a tough time. For 2 days now, its value has been falling. Beijing was forced to make an intervention. China's state-owned banks were asked to step up and defend the yuan. They're selling US dollars from their reserves and buying the yuan from foreign exchanges. And they've been doing this for the past 2 days. Today, China released export data from the month of November, and for the first time in 6 months, Chinese exports have grown. But this is one good headline amid a deluge of bad news. The Moodys report is an indictment. It confirms what experts have always known. China's economy faces fundamental problems. It's a bit like long COVID. There is a lingering illness. The symptoms are stubborn and they're not going away. The available cures are not working. Plus, there is the issue of trust. Reports say before releasing this latest assessment, Moodys officials sent a message to their staff. Their employees working in China, they got a message. They were asked to work from home, to not show up in office. Why? Apparently, Moodys was afraid of a government backlash. As it is, foreign companies face harassment in China. An adverse report on the Chinese economy would make them more vulnerable. In recent months, Chinese authorities have raided them and detained their staff. And which companies have been targeted? It's a long list, including names like Foxconn, Capvision, Brain & Company, and the Mintz Group. China has raided all of them. Now, Moodys is afraid it could be next. But what explains this intensifying scrutiny? What's driving these raids and detentions in China? Beijing wants to muzzle the critics, stop accurate data from flowing out, and control the narrative on their economy. That's classic China for you. When confronted with criticism, they crack down. On most occasions, the strategy works, but this time, it's not working. The crackdown came too late. The cat is out of the bag. There is a cash crunch across the board, starting with the government itself. Chinese cities and provinces owe trillions of dollars in debt, and they're struggling to service this debt. We've talked about this before, and now there is fresh data. Data about the size of Chinese government debt. How much do China's local governments owe? Anywhere between $7 to $11 trillion. That's the estimate of the International Monetary Fund and Wall Street banks, up to $11 trillion of debt. A significant chunk of these loans are risky, and the value of this debt is anywhere between $400 and $800 billion. We do not have exact figures because China is not transparent with data. So these are estimates. These loans are classified as high risk, meaning local governments may struggle to repay them. They may even default. So there is a significant debt burden and a shortage of cash. How would you respond to a situation like this? You don't have to be a financial expert. All you need is common sense. Cut expenses, raise earnings, and try to renegotiate the terms of your debt. That's what most people and most countries would do. Not China, though. When China faces a financial crunch, it responds by issuing more debt. And that's what local governments in China are doing. This year, they have sold a record number of special bonds. Do you know how much money they raised? More than $21 billion and counting. And this money is to save multiple small and medium banks, the ones under strain, the ones running low on cash. There are very many of them. So Chinese officials are raising funds and using new loans to recapitalize banks. Last month, some state-owned banks raised money too. Reports say there was a liquidity squeeze. Banks needed more money to service short-term obligations. So they decided to borrow. Now, what does all of this tell you? China's entire financial system is fragile, it is addicted to debt and surviving on a continuous cycle of borrowing. One default can trigger a storm, and the devastation will be felt way beyond China. Our next story features Starbucks. The coffee giant has a big problem. In their language, a grande problem. The company has lost around $11 billion. That's 10% of their value, just wiped off. How did it happen? Thanks to the Israel-Hamas war. Starbucks supported Israel. This led to a boycott. Then there were strikes. Starbucks union stood in solidarity with Palestine, and all of this has driven away customers. Looks like no one likes their coffee flavored with political tension. But what does it mean for Starbucks, the company? Can they survive this onslaught? Our next report explores.
How do you like your coffee? Hot, cold, with a dash of cinnamon, or with a side of political tensions? Well, it depends on who you ask, but looks like politics and coffee don't go hand in hand. And Starbucks is learning it the hard way. The coffee giant has lost $11 billion in value. That's nearly 10% of the company's value erased. So what explains this? Were the holiday flavors not up to the mark? Or are customers tired of pumpkin spice? Sadly, it's none of that. Customers still love their overpriced lattes, but not with a political opinion. After the Israel-Hamas war broke out, Starbucks found itself in hot water. Like many companies, it expressed support for Israel. But that didn't go down well in West Asia. In November, Starbucks in Egypt reportedly laid off workers. It was forced to cut expenses. Why? Because there were just no customers. Then there are the Starbucks unions. It's called Starbucks Workers United. They reportedly posted solidarity with Palestine on X. The tweet was swiftly deleted, but it sparked calls for a boycott. Starbucks also distanced itself from the comments, but the damage was already done. Then came the strikes. Starbucks workers are unhappy with their jobs. They feel they're underpaid, understaffed, and don't have enough rights. So they decided to strike, not in one store, but in 200 stores across America. The result? Slow sales during the holiday season.
So basically, Starbucks puts these promotions on us that is like buy one, get one free drinks or double star days. And they put more and more work on the actual baristas and the workers without giving us any ability or control to turn off mobile orders, which puts such a stress on us.
I mean, I was almost homeless last week. Even though I work at a store that supposedly pays better, they've been withholding card tip from us. So the amount of money you make is not enough to make rent. It's not enough to get groceries.
All of this has contributed to Starbucks' woes. Stocks have declined for 12 consecutive market sessions. This is the longest ever recorded streak ever since the company went public in 1992. Currently, the stock is hovering at around $95, down from a yearly high of around $114. The coffee giant is still optimistic, but the losses don't paint a good picture. Who knew that a simple cup of coffee could be so politically charged? As Starbucks stirs up a bitter brew, it looks like the company's caffeinated dreams have hit a slump. Can they recover from this? Well, their CEO remains hopeful, but the numbers don't look so good. Looks like sipping a cup of Starbucks is no longer just a choice of beverage, it's a political statement.
Now let's talk about Myanmar. The junta is losing ground to rebel groups. Fighting has been going on for weeks now, and India is trying to contain the crisis. Yesterday, a delegation from Myanmar was in New Delhi. They met with Indian diplomats, and New Delhi had one message for them: return to democracy. The statement said, and I'm quoting, the Indian side reiterated its support to Myanmar for a transition towards a federal democracy. How should this be interpreted? Well, the wording is fairly straightforward. India wants democracy to return to Myanmar. But this statement is also a subtle acknowledgement. New Delhi appears to be recalibrating. You see, 2 years back, there was a coup in Myanmar. The elected leader, Aung San Suu Kyi, lost power. The West slammed and sanctioned the generals, but India did not. India showed patience, perhaps hoping that the generals would restore democracy. Also remember, India has a long border with Myanmar. It also has major strategic investments in Myanmar. So New Delhi tried to make the best of a bad situation. And that meant engaging with the coup leaders. But now there seems to be a shift. The junta is losing control of military bases and with them, their authority to govern. So India is preparing for yet another change, potentially a future without these generals. And it is quite likely. The rebels are growing stronger. Let me give you a recent assessment. As of the 4th of December, the rebels control more than 200 military bases, plus large numbers of weapons. And beyond military assets, they also control multiple highways, roads, and trade routes. This list includes a town called Chinchwiho. It is near China's Yunnan province, and it's an important trade checkpoint. Let me show you why. From April to September this year, Myanmar sent goods worth $1.8 billion to China. These goods were moved through the land borders, and more than 25% of them went through this one checkpoint, Chinchwiho. So the losses for the junta are wide-ranging. The impact of this offensive is being felt not just on the military, but also on Myanmar's economy. Plus, the generals face a revolt in their ranks. Soldiers are giving up arms, even joining the rebels. And this is a sign of impending disaster. For any military regime, manpower is critical. They need a strong fighting force. It legitimizes the authority of the generals, it enables them to enforce their decisions, and it helps them keep power. But Myanmar's military is rotting from within, and this decline started long ago, well before the rebel offensive. In the month of May, an assessment exposed the rot. Over the course of several months, Myanmar's military had lost some 21,000 service members. 21,000 had left. And 3 reasons were given behind these losses: killed in action, desertions, or defections. In recent weeks, the losses have increased. The rebel forces have released many videos. They show soldiers from Myanmar's military surrendering. Now, we don't have a confirmed number, but reports say hundreds of soldiers have switched sides. Some even tried to cross into India. Since the beginning of this offensive, India has sent back more than 70 soldiers of the Myanmar army. They entered India after rebels took over their posts. So the generals are in a tough spot, losing control over bases, over trade routes, and over troops. Perhaps the reason why they want to negotiate now. The junta chief has made an outreach calling for a political solution. But the rebels may not agree. They have the upper hand at this point, and they will not give up their gains so easily. Where does all of this leave India? With a 1,600-kilometer-long border with Myanmar, the risk of the conflict spilling over, and uncertainty over Indian investments. Like the Kaladan Transport Project. It connects India's northeast to Myanmar. And the India-Myanmar-Thailand Highway. India gives a lot of development assistance to this country. The value of these projects is almost $2 billion. And out of this, $1.25 billion is in the form of grants. To unlock the full potential of these projects, India needs stability in Myanmar. But the current situation is the opposite of stable. And after yesterday's events, one thing is quite clear. New Delhi will not be a passive observer. Obnoxious blowhard, Voldemort, fascist neocon, angry, bitter man. No, I'm not reading out hate comments from YouTube. This is what Republicans are calling each other. Republicans who want to become America's next president. This is their language. Yesterday was the final Republican presidential debate of 2023. It started with a full stage, but now there are only 4 left. 2 of them know they will not make it to the next one, so the knives were out. But even then, it was a no-show from Donald Trump. He missed 3 debates before, and this time too, he did not care for it. Our next report tells you why.
And then there were 4. former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, tech billionaire Vivek Ramaswamy, and former New Jersey Governor Christie. It was time for the final Republican debate of 2023, a debate for Republicans to choose their candidate. Instead, it was a shouting fest, fiery exchanges, obnoxious comments, and the shadow of Donald Trump looming over the four. Donald Trump missed this debate, like he's missed every other Republican debate. But that doesn't seem to bother him, because he's far, far ahead in the polls. However, for the others, it's a huge problem. This makes the debates just another fleeting watch. No Trump equals to less viewership. So these candidates must scramble for the attention of the viewers. They have to prove they're just as engaging, which explains the exchanges at the News Nation debate.
The only person more fascist than the Biden regime now is Nikki Haley, who thinks the government should identify every one of those individuals with an ID. That is not freedom, that is fascism, and she should come nowhere near the levers of power, let alone the White House.
Let me tell you something. This is the fourth debate that you would be voted in the first 20 minutes as the most obnoxious blowhard in America. So shut up for a little while.
Like every debate, this one too had a target. It was Nikki Haley. The former UN ambassador is number 3 in polls, but she's seeing a surge, and the momentum has left others threatened.
Nikki is corrupt. This is a woman who will send your kids to die so she can buy a bigger house. This is the problem. Using identity politics more effectively than Kamala Harris is a form of intellectual fraud.
Governor Haley, would you like to respond?
No. It's not worth my time to respond to him.
Then there was Vivek Ramaswamy. After the first debate, he was the Republican favorite. He enjoyed a surge in donations, but is now down from the peak. So for him, this was the perfect time to whip out conspiracy theories. He called the 2020 elections rigged, endorsed a racist theory, doubted climate change, and called his fellow candidates fascist.
Why am I the only person on the stage, at least, who can say that January 6th now does look like it was an inside job?
Which brings us to the man who cried Trump, Christie. He's nowhere in the polls, but he was the only one to mention Trump and the fact that he had missed 4 debates.
This is an angry, bitter man who now wants to be back as president because he wants to exact retribution on anyone who has disagreed with him, anyone who has tried to hold him to account.
The Iowa caucuses are just 40 days away. That's where Republicans will choose their president. By the looks of it, it will be Donald Trump. He's leading in the polls, a historically large lead at that. His polling has only gone from strength to strength, which explains why he skipped the debates. Why share the stage with distant rivals when you can just make speeches and get votes? Plus, Trump has never been a fan of rules or the system. By skipping these debates, he's proved that once again. He's shown that he's bigger than the party. The Republicans may hold multiple debates, but they're nothing but a sideshow. We all know who will be the Republican candidate for 2024.
What do you do when you make a mistake? You apologize, that's the first thing. But what if that mistake killed millions of people, impoverished millions more, plundered entire continents and left generations with trauma? I don't think an apology cuts it then. And that's what former colonies are saying to European countries. A sorry is not enough. You need to pay up. And leading that charge is Barbados. Their Prime Minister is in the UK right now. Her name is Mia Mottley. And I must say, she's done her homework. She did not just make an appeal for reparations. She came with an exact figure. $4.9 trillion. That's how much she wants European countries to pay Barbados, $4.9 trillion. Most of it is for slavery. Around 450,000 slaves were trafficked to Barbados. Only 375,000 made it alive, and the rest, they died at sea. Around 30,000 slaves died working on the plantations. They died working for European powers. So Barbados wants the UK to pay up. But where did the 4.9 trillion come from? A report published by the Brattle Group. It's a consulting company based in the US. It specializes in complex calculations like How much do European countries owe for slavery? The numbers will surprise you. The UK owes $24 trillion to 14 countries. Barbados is one of them, 24 trillion for the UK. Spain, $17 trillion. France, $9 trillion. And the Netherlands, $4.8 trillion. Now, these numbers may sound like a lot. 24 trillion is 8 times the UK's national GDP. 17 trillion is 12 times the Spanish GDP. So how can these claims be realistic? Well, the Barbados Prime Minister has an answer. She says, don't take them out of context. This wealth was accumulated over decades and centuries. If you think like that, the numbers are small. And we agree. Here in India, colonial reparations are a hot topic. A couple of years back, the foreign minister also spoke about it. He said Britain looted $45 trillion from India. Imagine that, $45 trillion taken away. That's 13 times India's current GDP. And colonialism does not just take away money. It takes away confidence, it takes away time, and it takes away self-respect. Sometimes it can take decades to regain those. So if anything, 45 trillion is too less. Now, coming back to Barbados, their Prime Minister took charge in 2018, and since then, she's been campaigning for reparations. She's also hosted a summit in July this year, a summit for reparations. A number of African and Caribbean nations attended the summit. They agreed on the demand for reparations. And last month, they followed up on it. The African Union and Caribbean nations created a joint fund. We're talking about 75 countries in total. They've asked European nations to pour money into this fund. But do not expect anyone to actually do it. Most former colonial powers use the same strategy. They will admit that colonialism was wrong. They will say it was a mistake. But they won't do the two things that really matter: apologize and pay. They don't do it. Just look at Britain. King Charles was supposed to be the progressive king. Last year, he gave a landmark speech at the Commonwealth meeting. He said, it's time to acknowledge the impact of slavery. And that speech is what spurred Barbados. Their Prime Minister thought apology and reparations would follow. Well, she was wrong. Charles is yet to apologize. So is his Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak.
I want to ask the Prime Minister today if he will do what Bernie Grant asked all those years ago, what I have asked and what countless others have asked since, and offer a full and meaningful apology for our country's role in slavery and colonialism and commit to reparatory justice.
No, Mr. Speaker. What I think our focus should now be on doing is, of course, understanding our history in all its parts, not running away from it, but right now making sure that we have a society which is inclusive and tolerant of people from all backgrounds. That's something that we on this House, our side of the House, are committed to doing and will continue to deliver, but trying to unpick our history is not the right way forward and is not something that we will focus our energies on.
Do you see the problem? They can't even apologize for their crimes. How can we expect them to pay trillions of dollars? As things stand, it's impossible, which is why former colonies are moving on themselves, including Barbados. In 2021, they parted ways with the monarchy. Barbados declared itself a republic. Antigua and Barbuda are doing the same. Their government has announced a referendum. Chances are the people will reject the British monarchy. And this process will continue. Younger generations will demand a reset. But that alone does not acquit these European powers. They're all democracies. All of them talk about the rule of law. Well, it's time to walk the talk, we say. You committed a crime all those years back. But the victims are yet to be compensated and the culprits yet to be punished. Now let's turn our attention to South America, where an oil war is bubbling between two hostile neighbors, Venezuela and Guyana. Tensions are on the rise, mostly thanks to this man, Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela. He wants to take over a part of Guyana, in fact, 2/3 of the country. I'll repeat that for you. Maduro wants control over 2/3 of his country's neighbor. And we get that it is Christmas season, but this is a very big ask. Obviously, Guyana does not agree. And now Brazil has deployed troops along the border, so things are heating up here. To understand this story, we must know a bit of their history. Let me show you a map. This is Esquibo, the territory in question. This is what Maduro wants. In size, it is larger than Greece. In substance, it is deeply important. For over a century, Essequibo has been part of Guyana, but Venezuela has long disputed this. They say Essequibo was stolen from them. Their border was drawn more than a century ago, and Essequibo was wrongly given to Guyana. Guess who drew this disputed border? Who else but the British? It's their unique gift to the world, contentious borders that lead to wars. So Venezuela has been upset for decades, and they've sought control of Essequibo. But in 2015, their effort became more urgent. That's when oil was discovered off the coast of Essequibo. So now this region is not just contentious, it is also oil-rich. And Venezuela wants it even more. And Guyana won't let go. Their wealth is mostly based on oil production and exports. Oil has made Guyana one of the fastest growing economies in the world. Do you know what their GDP growth was last year? 62%. 62% GDP growth in 1 year, the highest in the world. So Guyana is doing really well. Its neighbor, on the other hand, is struggling. That's Venezuela. Now, interestingly, Venezuela is also oil-rich. It is home to the world's largest oil reserves, in fact. But over time, oil production has seen a drastic decline there thanks to American sanctions and mismanagement. Now, hyperinflation is rampant and the country is in the middle of an economic crisis. It desperately needs a magic potion. And it's hoping that that potion is Guyana's oil. So last weekend, Venezuela held a referendum to claim rights over Essequibo. People were asked to vote, but they did not show up. The voter turnout was only 10%. And what was the verdict? 95% of them approved the referendum. They said Venezuela should take over this part of Guyana, 2/3 of Guyana. And Maduro is wasting no time. He has ordered the state oil company to look for oil in Essequibo. He's told energy companies there to leave within 3 months. He plans to pass a bill to make the area part of his country and to grant Venezuelan citizenship to the people there. All of this has unsettled Guyana.
This is a direct threat to Guyana's territorial integrity, sovereignty, and political independence. Guyana views this as an imminent threat to its territorial integrity and will intensify precautionary measures to safeguard its territory.
Guyana is on the edge. Its defense forces are on alert. It has asked the United Nations Security Council to intervene. Meanwhile, Brazil has deployed troops on its border with Guyana and Venezuela. And where there is a problem, there is America. The US has issued stern comments.
We would urge Venezuela and Guyana to continue to seek a peaceful resolution of their dispute. This is not something that will be settled by a referendum.
Reports say the US is backing Guyana. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has expressed support, both verbally and militarily. America has announced air exercises with Guyana. Meanwhile, Venezuela is moving fast. So is this the making of another war? At this point, it seems unlikely. Venezuela is in no position to fight a war. Maduro's actions are still largely symbolic. Less about oil and more about politics. Under Maduro's rule, Venezuela has continued its steady descent into economic collapse and political chaos. They're also heading into a presidential election next year. So Maduro needs a distraction, and Essequibo is just that, a distraction. Only time will tell if playing troublemaker pays off for him. From one conflict, let's move to another. And this is not a battle for oil or a war over land. It is about sensory overload. From crowing roosters to rumbling tractors, even the smell of manure wafting from a stable. In a French countryside, this is the standard sensory landscape. And the city dwellers despise it. It has led to regular squabbles, high-profile disputes, and nearly 500 farmers currently facing lawsuits, 500 cases. So now the French Parliament has passed a new law which makes it difficult for people to file complaints against farmers and their animals. You could say it's a law that gives roosters the right to crow. Here's a report.
Crowing roosters, croaking frogs, bleating sheep, braying donkeys. The smell of manure, the rumble of tractors. Don't worry, we aren't going to break into a rap on the farm life. This is simply an ode to the countryside, courtesy France. The country is on a mission to protect the perennial sounds and smells of its rural areas. The French Parliament has passed a new law to limit conflicts between neighbours, preserve the sensory heritage of the countryside, and give more protection to farms. Here's why. France has a long history of conflict in its rural areas between newly arrived residents from cities and the OG countryside residents. The city slickers have a bunch of complaints. The roosters are too loud. The frogs are one too many. The smell of manure is too much to bear. This has led to regular neighbourhood spats and widely publicised high-profile legal cases. In fact, nearly 500 farmers are currently facing lawsuits from neighbours over smells and sounds coming from their farms.
My ducks make noise and this bothers the neighbour. He is going to court. This is ridiculous. This will stop 15 days from now when I slaughter the ducks.
In Dordogne, a court ordered a couple to drain their pond after neighbours complained about incessant frog croaking. In Alsace, a court ruled that a horse had to stay at least 50 feet from the neighbouring property after people complained about smelly droppings. In Le Bousseau, tourists complained about the singing of cicadas. The mayor responded by installing a 6-foot statue of one. But perhaps the noisiest bird of them all was Moodys, a rooster in a French town. His owner was sued by neighbours because he crowed too loudly. This turned into quite the circus. Politicians got involved. Petitioners rushed to the rooster's defence.
They must stop filing lawsuits over nothing. The noises in the countryside are normal. If you don't like such noises, then you shouldn't be staying here.
Eventually, in 2019, the court ruled that the rooster was well within its rights to crow as much as it wants. But some animals weren't that lucky. In 2020, a French rooster was shot and beaten to death because a neighbour was tired of its crowing. Over 100,000 petitioners clamoured for justice. The culprit was given a 5-month prison sentence, and a year later, France came up with its first law to protect its countryside. Smells, sounds and everything. But this didn't cut it, so the government has bolstered it further. Now, the new law is broader. It says that no resident can challenge the activity of farmers who were operating there before the complainant arrived. So, with the new law, the neo-rural residents will no longer find it easy to file complaints. In fact, the Justice Minister called such complaints abusive. He said, this law will put an end to abusive lawsuits against farmers who do nothing but their job, feed us. And many people agree. After all, rural areas aren't just sceneries. They aren't just ideal backdrops for Instagram posts. The countryside comes with its sounds, smells, practices and creatures. So now the roosters can crow on with the law behind them. As for the neo-rurals, it seems the chickens have come home to roost.
And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. If there is one thing you must not do on air, it is making any sort of gesture. And offensive ones are a particular no-no. I guess no one warned this BBC anchor. You have to see what she ended up doing on air. In Australia, driving after dark just got interesting as glow-in-the-dark road markings illuminate the outback. And we've all heard about Santa Claus riding his sleigh. But in Guatemala, he took the helicopter to visit sick children. Finally, we're taking you back in history. On this day in 1941, Japanese bombers attacked the US base at Pearl Harbor. The Americans lost more than 2,400 service members. This surprise attack led to America joining the Second World War. We're leaving you on that note. Thank you for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.
Radio's tuned in to a typical American program, obviously faked in a studio. Propaganda scenes of the attack itself, filmed on a miniature studio set of Pearl Harbor with carefully posed shots of the heroes of the hour. But these very obvious battleship models shouldn't have fooled anybody. Warlords of Japan boasted that they'd knocked out the American fleet, which was very nearly the truth, although they themselves didn't believe it. More battle pictures with dive bombers at work on oil tanks and road transport, but here's a puzzle. How could the aerial cameraman film this blast from the ground? Now he's up in the air again.
Live from London, this is BBC News. Britain's former Prime Minister Boris Johnson...
¡Hola! ¿Cómo está?
¿Qué calidad?
Eso.
El que le tocó.
Eso.